Now then, in this stream, we're going to cover quite a bit. First of all, we're going to introduce me. I want you guys to get to know who I am before we really get started. So it's a short introduction, you know, who's this guy anyway? Then we're going to cover learning, and we're going to allow for some questions, and we're going to cover cognition, and then allow for some more questions. So those are our two topics. Now, for those of you that have taken AP Psychology or even regular psychology before, you know that those are two very big topics. So having an hour to talk about it is going to be a challenge. But that said, I think we're up to it. We're going to get through it. And if nothing else, you can always watch the replay and download this and view the slides at your convenience. Thank you, Tigist. So, first of all, who am I? My name is Darren Rudman. I am a AP World and European History teacher, and I also teach psychology here in Henderson, Nevada. I teach at a small private school, and I really enjoy it, actually. I've been teaching full-time for, coming in on almost 10 years now. Basically, I really love doing what I do. This is my very first time live streaming, so I do appreciate your patience with me and being patient with all my ums and uhs. But more than everything else, let's get down to why we're here and why we're here to revert learning and condition, of course, you silly people. So let's start with the very basics. What is learning? Learning, to define it in vocabulary terms, and in terms of AP Psychology, is a relatively permanent change. That's the thing about learning. It's a relatively permanent change, not a temporary one, but a permanent change in an organism's behavior due to experience. So we kind of got to break that down if we think about it. Learning is change, but it only happens based on experience. You can't just learn learn by osmosis. You can't sleep on your textbook and hope you understand biology. You actually have to do the work, be that, going through the motions or studying the material. Now, there are three major types of learning that we're going to review. There's associative learning or association, conditioning, we're going to subdivide that into two types, and observational learning. All of them have tremendous benefits. All of them are really great ways to learn new things. And basically, what we're going to do is we're going to go through them and try to understand how to better use them in our own day-to-day lives. So let's start with association. Learning to connect or associate to events or symbols is association. Now, something to understand is that these two events or symbols or what have you, even sounds, are not necessarily readily connected in nature. For example, when you see this red octagon with the white border on it, what do you think first thing? Well, personally, I think a stop sign. Yes, stop. Very good. Stop sign. Thank you very much. Appreciate you guys responding. Awesome. Thank you. Just think a stop sign. And that's a normal thing to think in basically all of North American culture and many other countries as well. But those aren't connected in nature. There's no stop signs growing out of the ground or even growing out of trees. Though sometimes it might feel like they grow out of trees because they appear so suddenly when you're driving around. But that's something that we've learned to associate. That shape, that color, that border is something we associate as a stop sign, especially if we drive. Now, when we talk about associations, have anybody ever heard of a guy named Ivan Pavlov? Good, because he's the king of associations. Exactly. He's the great granddaddy of all things behaviorism and conditioning. But the funny thing is, he wasn't even a psychologist. When we talk about classical conditioning, we have to talk about Ivan Pavlov because he was a Russian physiologist, not a psychologist, that showed us that dogs could learn to associate the ringing of a bell with food, causing them to drool. Yeah, they tend to be the most talked about. Absolutely, Tigist. Mostly because their experiments are really interesting things. Freud was interesting. Yeah, he was kind of nuts, but at the same time, he really broke the ground that would eventually become psychology. If it wasn't for him, I don't think any of us would be sitting here learning this material. So as crazy and sex obsessed as he was, and as big as he was on cocaine and cigars, we owe him a lot. He does look a little bit scary. He's a little bit intense, but keep in mind he's Russian into the late 1800s. It's kind of how everybody looked back then. So when we talk Pavlov, we gotta know that it rings a bell. And why does it ring a bell? Because he's who showed us that through classical conditioning, you can make organisms associate things that are not normally associated in nature with each other. In his case, making a sound and causing a dog to drool. Now, some terms you'll want to recognize as we go through classical conditioning are UCS, UCR, CS, and CR. What are they? UCS is the unconditioned stimulus, the stimulus that is normal in nature. UCR is the unconditioned response, the response that's normal in nature. So say a dog smells food, it makes him or her drool. Those would be the unconditioned stimulus, the smell of food, and the unconditioned response, the drooling. The conditioned stimulus, well, that's going to be our bell ringing in this case, and the conditioned response is going to be the drooling. So you'll notice when we're talking about classical conditioning, the UCR and CR are the exact same thing. What we're doing is changing what causes it, right? So, and that's an important, thing to understand. The UCS and CS are different things, but the UCR and CR are the same. So when we talk about the experiment that Ivan Pavlov did, we have to look at what he did. So he took food, which is an unconditioned stimulus, and salivation, which is unconditioned response. Correct, exactly. The UCS is also a neutral stimulus. It's also called the neutral stimulus, precisely. Normally, a bell would not make a dog drool. It might make his ears perk up. It might make him wonder where that nifty sound came from, but it wouldn't make him drool. During conditioning, the bell and food were offered simultaneously. You ring the bell, offer the food, and of course the dog's gonna drool because dogs tend to be pretty food motivated. I've got 3 of them at home. Trust me, they love their food. Once the dog became conditioned, there you go. Once the dog became conditioned, you didn't have to offer the food to get them to drool. All you had to do is ring that bell, and as a conditioned response, the dog would eventually drool. Would immediately drool. And it's that immediate connection, that forming of an association that shows us we have conditioning present. Thing about it is, though, unless you reinforce that conditioning from time to time, it will deteriorate, eventually go away. So, building on the work of our friend Ivan Pavlov, we saw a gentleman step up to the plate by the name of John B. Watson, and he took classical conditioning to that next step. Building off of Pavlov's work, he brought us the area of psychology now known as behaviorism, which has kind of fallen to the wayside, at least in its pure form. But if you think about it, though, you can still see lots of it in cognitive behavioralism, neurobehavior, behavioral anatomy, things like that. The things that they started are not gone completely. They've just grown and evolved. But Watson was a funny guy. First of all, to me, he looks a little bit like Walt Disney, which is a little creepy when you start to thinking about what he did. But on top of that, you gotta, for real, very nice. But you also got to look at what he was looking at, and he and his cohorts in behavioral psychology, wanted to study behavior without worrying about all the warm, squishy bits of the mind. They're not looking at the inner mind, the thoughts, the feelings, the emotions. They don't care about that. They want to see behaviors that they can measure and that they can quantify. And so what did Watson do? Well, one thing he's most famous for is his experiment with a infant that was dubbed Little Albert. And what he did was he conditioned fear into that baby, which is just gives you all kinds of warm fuzzies, doesn't it? And he did it to prove that something that the infant would not normally in nature be afraid of could be taught to be afraid of. Poor Albert is absolutely right, to you guys. All kidding aside, Watson really did horrible things for that kid, and in the long run, while we don't know for certain if the experiments on him causes early death, he did die at a very young age. So yeah, it's a rough thing. Now, when we talk about little Albert, we start looking at more terms to understand. Stimulus generalization, which is a learned response to stimuli that are similar to the original conditioned stimulus. So in the case of Pavlov, ringing a bell and playing a high note on a xylophone, say, or using a tuning fork and using a bell would both make the dog drool if the stimulus was generalized. Stimulus distinction, on the other hand, is a learned response to a specific stimulus, not to other similar stimuli. Just the tuning fork, just the bell. And in the case of Albert, we were introduced to a brand new idea, the CER, the conditioned emotional response, in this case, fear. So let's talk about the experiment. Little Albert was shown a bunch of things that he normally wouldn't have been afraid of: a white rat, a bunch of toys, some bunnies, all kinds of stuff. And during conditioning, the psychologist and his assistant made a real loud noise right next to Albert while showing him the little rat. Very quickly, Albert started to associate that loud noise, the fear of that loud noise, with the rat. And it didn't take long at all, because humans are higher mammals. We learn far more quickly than other mammals do. Most mammals, dolphins are pretty good too. And pretty soon, Albert was scared to death of that rat. All they had to do was bring out the rat, didn't have to get it near him. And the second Albert saw it, he became inconsolable with fear. And then on top of that, Albert generalized his CER, his conditioned emotional response, to the point where anything white, fluffy, and soft scared the bejesus out of him. Literally, you could bring a white fur coat near the kid and he'd be terrified. And those fears actually stuck with him for a long time. It really ruined him. Now, a little PSA for you. I do want to let you know, conditioned fear response experiments like what was done to little Albert are no longer happening today. Okay, much to my relief, I'm sure to yours as well. And the reason for that is because there's far more rigorous ethical standards that are required to be met in experimental psychology. One of the reasons that the little Albert experiment exists at all is because at the time there were no standards, because nothing like it had ever been done. There was no, hey, that's not right, because they didn't know what would happen next. They had their hypothesis, but they did not know. But thankfully nowadays we can't do CER experiments anymore, which is probably for the better, because some people, let's admit, are a little demented. So moving right along, we go into more conditioning, but this time, instead of classical conditioning, we're going to talk about operant conditioning. And the big bad voodoo daddy of it all, B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner was one of the first true learning psychologists. He's an amazing individual. He was responsible. Yeah, he was actually. So he built on functionalist thought. Very good. Actually, thank you so much. He was a functionalist, but he was also a behaviorist. And he invented a whole lot of different learning technology, including the one he's most famous for, which was the operant chamber, as he called it, or as we often refer to it as, the Skinner box. Now, the Skinner box, as sinister as it may sound, is actually not a horrible torture chamber or anything like that. It is just a chamber where... A little bit, actually. Yes, he is relevant in that Skinner built on his work. So we're going to bring him up in just a minute. Thank you, Amani. He doesn't end up being as relevant. We're talking about learning because they took his work and really built on it to, expand the concept of learning in psychology. But thank you for bringing him up. I appreciate that. Now, a term you should understand when talking about operant conditioning is that it's learning where behavior is strengthened following reinforcement or diminished following punishment. Okay, so strengthened with reinforcement, diminished with punishment. And the reason I emphasize that is because there's parts of that, equation that can be very easy to mix up, such as negative reinforcement versus punishment. Okay, and they're not the same. Right, the law of effect. Thank you, Teast. So let's talk about B.F. Skinner. Skinner's work elaborated on Edward Thorndike's law of effect. Thank you, folks. Well done. Now, Thorndike, back in 1898, so quite a long time ago, showed that responses with satisfying effects, things that bring you some sort of pleasure or satisfaction when responding to a situation, are more likely to happen again. And why did that matter? Well, it meant that you didn't have to whip a kid to get them to learn their numbers. You could actually praise them, and they might actually do better in school. Things like that. I know that's kind of an extreme example, but it's something that happened in the late 1800s. Sadly, exactly. Thankfully, we live in a much more elevated society than they did back then. And building on Thorndike's law of effect, Skinner pioneered behavioral technologies such as his Skinner box and other behavioral tech, that some of which has evolved and grown since then, and we still use today, especially in experimental psychology. So some terms you want to recognize when we talk about operant conditioning are going to be shaping, which is reinforcement, which is the phenomenon where reinforcement guides behavior towards a target behavior using successive approximations. And while that's a lot of very large words, to break it down into plain English, using small steps, you can get the person you're trying to learn an action, or the thing that you're trying, the subject you're trying to get to learn an action, to do what you want them to, right? Now, this is when it comes to shaping, you need reinforcement. You need to improve, take baby steps, as it were, to get from point A to point B. Positive reinforcement is any response that strengthens the behavior it follows, right? Positive reinforcement, giving a reinforcement. That's what the positive means, to give, and it strengthens the behavior that it follows. Negative reinforcement, on the other hand, is removing a punishment or unpleasant stimulus, such as a noisy bell or a painful stimulus of some sort, and that strengthens the behavior. Now, if an example of that is actually when you get in your car, if you don't put your seatbelt on right away, it starts to buzz at you. Ding, 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 ding. Put your seatbelt on. That is an unpleasant stimulus. It's obnoxious, right? You are being negatively reinforced to put on your seatbelt. Another example of that is taking ibuprofen or Tylenol when you have a headache. Exactly. Very good, Akshita. Thank you so much. But when you have a headache, it hurts, right? And that's unpleasant. Taking the Tylenol, the ibuprofen, the Aleve, whatever your medicine of choice is, removes the headache. That's negative reinforcement as well, right? It removes an unpleasant stimulus. Punishment, on the other hand, is different than negative reinforcement, okay? Punishment is an aversive event, something that's not pleasant, that weakens a behavior that it follows. So instead of strengthening behavior and getting people to do what you want them to, it gets them to not do something you don't want them to do. So there's two types, of course, when it comes to punishment as well. Positive punishment, in which you introduce an unpleasant stimulus, like a shock, a noise, something like that. And negative punishment, where you remove or withhold a pleasant stimulus. No cake for you. That would be an example of a negative punishment. So any of you that have ever been, gotten your phones taken away, gotten your internet suspended, or gotten, stuck in your room on grounding when you got a bad grade, know what a negative punishment is, huh? You can't get on your phone, can't talk to your friends. That's removing a pleasant stimulus. You like your tech. Everybody likes their tech. I love my tech. Not gonna lie. Now, when talking about operant conditioning, we got to talk about some of the experiments that happen. Is grounding positive or negative? So grounding's a funny one, Titus. Technically, it's both, right? It's both, because it takes away your freedom to go out and go around, right? Like if you get grounded from your phone, then it's negative. However, it's positive punishment in that you are more restricted. You have more responsibilities to do that you didn't want to do necessarily. Right? Good question. Okay, so in the case of operant conditioning, we have our mouse in the Skinner box. It has an electrified floor. No, it's not enough to kill him. It's only enough to be on a pleasant buzz. Okay. We have a speaker that causes a noise, that makes a noise. Lights of different colors. Rats and mice do see colors very vividly. A lever and a dispenser of treats. So when we talk about positive reinforcement, it increases the likelihood of a repeated behavior when something is given to the mouse. The mouse is given food when the lever is pressed after a green light. It teaches them to do it. To get them to stop pressing the lever, they're shocked after the red light. So they learn green light good, red light bad. And they learn it very quickly. When we talk about the negative side, something's taken away. So a loud noise from the speaker is turned off, which is a unpleasant stimulus, when the lever is pressed. And negative punishment, the negative punishment in this case was not applicable, but you get the idea. You guys have given some pretty good examples of that. So moving on in learning, and we're buzzing through this pretty quickly, but we still have a lot to cover. We have Albert Bandura and observational learning. Now, everybody loves to hate Albert Bandura, and I will admit I'm among them. And part of the reason is because we owe him the idea that violent video games cause violence. Bandura's experiments, especially the Bobo doll experiment in 1961, showed that people learn by watching others do things and then get rewarded or punished. And if it's somebody that they can look up to and they get a reward for their actions, they're likely going to copy that action. So yes, this is where we get the concept that violent video games, TV, movies, etc., make kids more violent, which stems from what he called social learning theory. So get your boo hisses out of the way. That's why the media loves to hate on violent video games. Yeah, that's him. So terms you want to understand when we're talking about observational learning, first of all, it's observational learning. It's learning by observing or imitating others. Modeling is observing and imitating a specific behavior, like learning to cook a dish from Food Network, right? So that's modeling behavior. Pro-social behavior is positive, constructive, helpful behavior. It's positive behavior. It's good stuff. It's doing good things for the community and for yourself. And a social behavior would be the opposite. It's negative, destructive, unhelpful behavior. Right. We're looking at expectations versus reality a lot of times. So let's talk about the experiment. So 72 children from Stanford, from the Stanford area of California. So they're all very well-to-do white kids at the time, because it was 1960s, and the community of Stanford was basically upper middle class to upper class white. So 72 of those kids from affluent families were taken and divided into 3 groups: 24 with an aggressive role model, 24 with a non-aggressive role model, and 24 in a controlled group with no model. If 6 boys, 6 girls, 6 boys, 6 girls, etc. One with a female model, one with a male model, one with a female model, one with a male model. And the kids were made to watch as these role models in the aggressive category beat the tar out of this poor Bobo doll. The non-aggressive role model was very kind to him, loved on him, hugged him. And then these kids, after seeing this behavior, were put into a room full of the coolest toys of the time and told, sorry, you can't play with these. Right. So you got a bunch of kids between like age 6 and 9 in a room full of the coolest toys they've ever seen, and they're told, nope, no playing for you. As expected, the kids with the aggressive model started wailing on Bobo. They grabbed stuff to hit him with. The kids with the non-aggressive model would be kind to Bobo, and they would play with him beyond everything else. And the kids from the control group didn't do a whole lot besides, kind of look at Bobo. And this is actually scenes from the experiment. As you can see, it's pretty straightforward, and it's not just the young man that's going nuts on Bobo. The girl is, I don't know if you can see here in the bottom right, second to last, she's got a hammer. She's taking a hammer to Bobo. So, and these are all kids from the aggressive model. They watched male and female models beat the tar out of Bobo, and they went right at it. And there's been a lot of criticisms for Bandura's work, especially since, it's hard to verify. But once it was out there, it was really out there. Yeah, Emily, I agree. It was a big OMG. Once it was out there, it was out there. And the idea that observing violence encourages kids to be violent really caught on. Now, there is some, validity to it, but it's come under a lot of fire over the years. The jury's still kind of out about it, but if you ask anybody that's ever seen anything from the media, a lot of your parents will say this too: violent video games, violent TV, violent movies make kids violent, right? So let's take a breath. I know we've covered a lot of material right now, so I want to take this moment, because we're done with the first half of it, and get some questions answered. We've answered a couple as we go. I'd appreciate that, but there has been one that's been waiting. So let's start with that one. What is your advice for someone who is scoring low right now on the 2018 and 2019 AP Psychology FRQ exams? So I really appreciate this person asking this. And my answer to that is really, part of it is going to be practice, practice, practice. Practice the skills, not just the material. Learning the material is really important. Why is it hard to verify? Seems like it wouldn't be too difficult to replicate. So it's actually okay. So we'll do that one in just a moment. I appreciate that. Thank you, Anya. So when it comes to the actual exam, practice makes perfect. Like any sort of muscle memory, when you're writing an essay, when you're doing, multiple choice, things like that, especially this year where everything's changed, everything's different because of the quarantine, right? Practice makes perfect. Practice writing a thesis. Practice defending your argument. Practice getting it done. And you do it with models. You do it by going along with YouTubers that, talk about how to do it. And then you also learn the material. And between knowing the material and practicing how to write the essays, you can definitely do better, okay? Who is Albert Bandura? Albert Bandura is our friend that taught a child, little Albert, to fear a small rodent. He's a classical conditioner that showed us conditioned emotional response, fear response. Great question. Why is it hard to verify? That's a good question too. Let's see here. Let's put that there. Let's put that there. So the reason it's hard to verify, yes, you can definitely, it's not too difficult to replicate, but when you replicate an experiment, you have to get all the conditions exactly the same to validate the results. And it's been kind of difficult to get the exact same results every time. There's a lot of research you can look up about it. I don't have it readily in hand, but if you look up, if you look it up, you'll find that while, yes, the jury's still out, there's a lot to understand. The last term, thank you so much for asking that, by the way. The last term, great question. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the last term in observational learning, to answer that question, just real quickly, was antisocial behavior. Okay, it is behavior that is not good for the community or good for yourself. It is being a bully. It is being mean, that sort of thing. Is it still learning if you forget the material? And yes, it is. And we're going to talk about that actually in cognition. the reason is because you can look at interference and recall issues. You could still have learned it without having remembered it, being able to recall it later on. And you're right, Tigis, there's other factors that could have influenced that we're not know about. Could I have a difference between the types of punishment and reinforcement? I keep confusing them. Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so positive reinforcement is when you're given, okay, let's make it simple. You cleaned your room. That's something that your parents love. As a positive reinforcement, they let you buy a new video game. Positive reinforcement. You got a new video game. Awesome. Or you got paid. Even easier. You're more likely to do it again. That you've been positively reinforced. Negative reinforcement is different than punishment, though. When you get in your car and you haven't put on your seatbelt yet, your car starts dinging at you. Ding, 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 ding. It's obnoxious, right? That is a negative stimulus, a aversive stimulus. That aversive stimulus makes you want to put on your seatbelt so it stops beeping. That's negative reinforcement. It's taking away something negative to get you to do something they want you to do. Positive punishment is giving an aversive stimulus. Negative punishment is taking away something you want. So you get grounded, you get your phone taken away. That's negative punishment. Okay, so when we talk about positive and negative, it's not, just the kind of things that, society says. Instead, it is talking about positive is give, negative is take away. Okay, so let's keep going. Appreciate the great questions. Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate you playing along. Yeah, like taking away a test or a homework pass. Very good, Tias. Okay, so before we start talking about cognition, we must remember. Negative punishment isn't the same as extinction. Extinction is when a association goes away. So that's when, if you haven't kept supporting an association in classical conditioning, it goes extinct, and then suddenly ringing the bell doesn't make the dog drool. Great question. So memory is the basis of basically everything. It's how we recognize our friends. It's how we understand language. It's how we recognize ourselves. Without memory, everyone would be a stranger. Every word would be complete Greek. It's all Greek to me. And we wouldn't even know who we were in the mirror. That's how important memory is. So memory is any indication that learning has persisted over time. It is our ability to store and retrieve information. These two subjects are very closely intertwined. Learning, memory, cognition, they're all together. But learning and cognition go hand in hand. So that's what memory is. Now, flashbulb. When we remember events, either by accident or on purpose, we remember stuff either by accident or on purpose. Sometimes we just remember something, but we didn't try. It just sticks, right? Insight's fun. Other times we're learning material, especially for our AP Psych exam. So we study, and we remember the material. Wonderful. But when you add high levels of emotion to it, like a song, songs are really good. Yeah, exactly. You hear a song and suddenly you know all the lyrics. When you add high levels of emotion to it, however, what you get is called a flashbulb memory. Now, flashbulb memories are very unique in that they're highly emotional, right? And that high emotion in the moment gives rise to a clear, strong, and persistent memory. Now, as clear, strong, and persistent as it is, like for me, I was a freshman in college when 9/11 happened, which tells you how old I am. I'm in my late 30s these days. I'm 37. But I was a freshman in college when the planes hit the Twin Towers. And I remember that day like it was yesterday. That's a flashbulb memory for me. But in reality, as clear as it seems to me, flashbulb memories are still prone to error. You can still misremember things. They've done a lot of amazing research on it. You can actually see some really nifty stuff on Netflix about it. There's a show called The Brain, I believe. It's really fascinating. So how do we make memories? It's all well and good to talk about remembering things, but how do we do it? So according to the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, which was originally proposed in 1968, we have our three-stage memory model, which is kind of a nifty thing. And so memories start with sensory memory, and then they go into short-term memory, or otherwise known as working memory, and then they get stored in long-term memory, which is great. You know, you have your sensory information, you work with it in working memory, and you store it in long-term. Wonderful. Simple, right? Ish. Let's talk about that. So let's get this thing started. Sensory memory. It's the immediate initial recording of sensory information in your memory system. It comes from your 5 senses: taste, touch, hearing, smell, sight. It's all the things you bring in all the time. You're getting stuff gets shoved into your sensory memory constantly. And if you were to remember all of it, you'd never stop thinking about everything. Which is why it's super short-lived and very often completely forgotten. It is when you actually take something into your sensory memory, like reading something in your textbook, that you decide you want to keep, that you have to start moving it into your working memory and working that information out. So let's go to the next step. It goes into your short-term and working memory. This is the conscious processing of information. It is applying effort to it, okay? Now, keep in mind, working memory has its limits. It's got limited capacity, 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information, however you bit them up. And it's brief, 20 to 30 seconds without active rehearsal. So if you get a phone number that you will remember, you know, some girl or guy that you think is really cute, and you don't happen to have your phone on you, so they tell you their number and you just keep repeating it to yourself over and over again until you can write it down. That's rehearsal. That's working with your working or short-term memory to make sure that you don't lose their number. The final-ish step, because it's one thing to store it, it's entirely another to retrieve it, is long-term memory. Long-term memory is the relatively permanent and limitless storehouse of information for the memory system. And when I say limitless, I mean it. Technically, as far as we can tell in psychology, you could store every bit of information in the universe in your long-term memory with room to spare. Yes, episodic is part of long-term memory, and we will talk about that. Let me put that in the questions thingy, because that's a good question too. Yes, thank you. So the thing about long-term memory is it's limitless. Storing all of it is one thing, though. Being able to retrieve all that information, that's something else entirely. So it's in limited capacity. It can just fit all of it, just all of it. And it's extreme storage duration. Functionally, it's permanent. However, if you, how do we choose what's short and what's long? Well, it goes, so we'll talk about that in just a moment. Akshita, I appreciate you asking. It's a great question too. I'm gonna try and keep the questions until the end of this, because we do have a lot of material still to cover, but I appreciate you guys asking. You guys are asking great questions. Thank you. So long-term memory, limitless and extreme. But retrieving that information is where things get tricky. So let's talk about the stages of memory. We already, we've figured out the model, but now let's talk about the stages of getting stuff into long-term memory. So we're making memories. How do we do it? Well, it's like this. We encode the information, we store the information, and then we have to retrieve it. Because storing it is only the first step. Getting it back when we need it, that's step number 2. So we start by encoding the information. Encoding is the process that controls movement from working to long-term memory, from the working memory to the long-term memory store. It's the input of memory. It requires attention and conscious effort. Now, sometimes that conscious effort doesn't happen as far as you can tell, but sometimes a song just sticks in your head, right? That's attention happening without your say-so, and it does happen. However, putting in the necessary effort leads to durable, accessible memories. It's one thing to have something shoved into your long-term memory that you then can't access unless you smell the right smell or hear the right, beats of a song. It's entirely another to work at it, store it properly, and set up the retrieval access so that you can get it back whenever you need it. That's high-end learning. So, memory effects. This is some more vocab for you. The spacing effect. It's just distributed practice, as in learning over time in small chunks, yields better long-term retention than mass practice, okay? Instead of sitting there and just cramming all your information in one night, hoping that it'll stick, if you space it out over the week, there's a better chance you'll pass the test on Friday instead of just trying to cram on Thursday night. The serial position effect is another thing. It is that when you're trying to remember a list of things, the stuff at the beginning and the stuff at the end is far easier to get to bring up. The stuff in the middle tends to disappear. Serial positioning. Primacy and recency, very good. Now, some memory aids for you, because I do want to help you out. Mnemonics are memory aids, and it's an interesting thing. Acronyms are often referred to as mnemonics, and yes, they are mnemonics, but mnemonics are not all mnemonics are acronyms, but all memory aid acronyms are mnemonics. Blah, blah, blah. Sorry about that. PEMDAS, yes, very good. So the method of loci is one of our first ones. It is using a familiar location to aid in encoding and recall. So it's walking yourself through your house to remember a list of things. Chunking is organizing items into familiar, recognizable units. If you try to remember that list of numbers, good luck to you. However, if you separate it into smaller chunks, 1776, 1492, 1812, or in 1941, you can more easily remember them. So what we chunk is 7 plus or minus 2. So it could be 5 or 9. So great question, Akshita. Thank you so much. I'll keep it on there just in case. Acronyms are another type of chunking, like ROIGI-BIV, PEMDAS, etc. There are ways to remember things more easily because red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, a little harder to remember than ROIGI-BIV. Parentheses, equals, multiply, divide, addition, subtraction, much harder to remember than PEMDAS, or please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. It kind of flows. Hierarchy is breaking complex information down into broad concepts that are then broken down into increasingly specific categories and subcategories. So if you ever took a bio class, it's like looking at how, you know, your genus, your species, your specific animal is broken down. That's hierarchy. Now, storage is how information is kept in the brain. And functionally, it's the brain's hard drive. There's two types of memories that get stored, implicit and explicit. Implicit memory is how we do that voodoo that we do so well. So it's going to be riding your bike. It's going to be jumping rope. It's going to be getting from your house to school if you walk. It's procedural memory. Very good, Akshita. Explicit memory are facts and experiences. It's the actual meat and potatoes of your life. It's understanding that this right here, by fact, is a Nintendo 3DS. That is explicit memory. Now, retrieval is all in your cerebellum. That's one of the places. Very good, Sasha. Retrieval is all about getting the info out of storage. It's all well and good to shove it in there and have it. Getting it back, that's when it gets tricky. Memories are not stored in a linear fashion. It's more like a rug, really. Never mind. And if you got that reference, you're a Whovian. Our web of associations can help us retrieve information, like words, places, emotions, and even smells. If you smell cookies baking, you might remember your grandma and baking cookies with them. If you see certain words, like the word help with an exclamation mark, if you're a real big Beatles fan, hey, I remember that song. If you see the, triggers. Very good, Tigas. Thank you so much. And priming is what gets that process started. It's the starting point. It's the match to the flame. It's the trigger that starts the bomb rolling, right? So it's what helps us better remember things. So if you want to remember the idea of a fire truck, you could prime that with siren, red, truck. That's the prime. That gets it started to remember the actual thing you're looking for. So, context effects. Smell cookies, that would be exactly. Thank you, Akshita. Thank you very much. So context effects is the context of memory affects recall and storage, okay? So there's a lot of different context effects available to us, but something to understand is that context can be everything, especially when you're writing an essay. Recall is easier when the context of the encoding matches the attempted retrieval. So let's talk about that. Déjà vu, which is literally French for I've already seen it. Cues from a current situation may subconsciously trigger retrieval of an earlier similar experience. When you walk into school and suddenly it's like, whoa, I've done this before, that's déjà vu. Now, admittedly, it's not the same as I was here yesterday. It's more, this feels like I've done all of this just now. Mood congruent memory is a funny thing in that experiences that match your current mood are easy to recall. So if you remember an experience and you were really upset, the next time you're really upset, it'll be easier to remember. If you remember an experience and you were really happy, the next time you're really happy, it'll be easier to remember. State-dependent memory is a funny thing. It is what's learned in one state, like being high, drunk, or depressed, or whatever, can be more easily remembered when you're in that same state. PSA, don't try this at home. Do not get drunk when learning for your AP Psych exam so that you can then be drunk when you take it. It's a bad idea. You won't remember most of it. Lord knows your essay won't make any sense. Now, the parts of your brain that do that memory thing include, but of course are not limited to, because obviously things are connected. But the major parts are going to be our prefrontal cortex, which is a sequence of events, not the actual events, just how they laid out. The amygdala, which is the emotional aspects of memories. The medial temporal lobe, or the MTL, which encodes new explicit memories and transfers them to long-term memory, explicit only. The hippocampus, which does the exact same thing, so you got to understand that they work together to get all that information into the long-term memory. And the cerebellum, memories involving movement. Thank you so much. Now that we remembered stuff, how do we forget it? If you brought it up, let's answer that question. How do we forget? Let me see. All right, so forgetting is the inability to retrieve information due to poor encoding, poor storage, or poor retrieval. Now, poor storage kind of comes along with poor encoding, so let's talk about encoding failures. It's the info was not encoded properly. For whatever reason, you didn't stick it into your brain correctly, and so it wasn't encoded properly. You're not able to remember it. Retrieval failure, on the other hand, is that the info was encoded correctly and even stored correctly, but for a bunch of different possible reasons, you can't get it back out. The Todd effect, TOT, tip of the tongue. Remembering something, it's on the tip of my tongue. I know it. That's that effect. That's a retrieval failure. Interference. There's two types of that. Yeah, I hate that too, Tigas. Interference is a funny thing because learning some information may disrupt retrieval of other information. There's two types. Proactive interference is when old information interferes with the recall of new information, like if you're learning a language. Say you're fluent in Spanish and now you're learning French. You try to recall your French for a test, and for some reason you're thinking, hola, señor, ¿cómo está? You're thinking of it in Spanish. That's proactive interference. Retroactive interference, on the other hand, is when new information interferes with the recall of old information. So say that you're learning Spanish and you already know French, you're trying to remember ¿cómo se va? And all you can remember is ¿cómo estás? Now, forgetting is all well and good, but like any good gamer, we've got to go boss level. We will get to that. Thank you, Akshita. That's a great question. So it's all well and good to forget stuff, but let's talk about forgetting in the boss level. Amnesia. That is severe memory loss, and it comes in multiple types. It's often involved with some sort of trauma, be it physical, emotional, what have you. And that is boss level forgetting. That's forgetting that sometimes doesn't ever go away. So anterior grade amnesia is you cannot make memories after the incident or trauma. Everything before the trauma, clear as a bell. You can remember all of it. Everything after, no dice. You're done. Retrograde is the opposite, where you can't remember anything before the trauma, but you can make memories after. Think of old to new information stops from learning. Think of old, new information stops from learning. Yeah, that's a really good way to do it, Tikas. If you think of retroactive, the new stops old. Pro, old stops anew. I like it when you guys help each other. It's great. Now, motivated forgetting is another way that we talking about boss level forgetting, and that's forgetting unknowingly, but it's unknowingly revising your memories due to trauma, stress, etc. Repression, from as noted by our friend Freud, is a defense mechanism that involves motivated forgetting. So let's talk about that momentarily. We'll put that in the question section. We may end up running over our hour time limit. We're definitely going to at this point. I'm happy to stick it out until we're done. If you guys got to leave, I totally get it. But I'm going to go through this entire thing so that anybody that has to leave can still get the information. I do appreciate you sticking around with me. It's just a lot to go through. Okay, memory construction. Yes, the replay will be available as far as I know. So memory construction, by definition, is while tapping into our memories, we filter or fill in missing pieces of information to make our recall more coherent. We can't possibly remember everything. And so as a result, when we try to remember things like big events, we'll fill little things in with what makes sense, and then it'll work. And which is why sometimes if you're talking about an event that a bunch of people that you know were involved in, you'll say like it went this way, and you'll be like, no, it was like this in that part. Oh, that's memory construction. The misinformation effect is incorporating misleading information into one's memory of an event. That's when somebody is actively giving you misleading information and you end up putting it in your memory anyway. Source amnesia, on the other hand, is attributing things to the wrong source of an event that we experienced, heard about, read about, or imagined. It's misattribution. Now, when thinking about cognition and why you should care, you need to remember that cogito ergo sum. Je pense, donc je suis. I apologize, my French is absolute garbage. But the fact of the matter is, I think, therefore I am. And that is from a philosopher by the name of René Descartes. People like Descartes have been thinking about thinking, if you will, for hundreds of years. That's really meta. In psychology, we take a bit of a different course of action when it comes to thinking about things, cognition. We try to figure out how we think about things. So welcome to Cognition and Cognitive Psychology. So let's get the terms out of the way. What is cognition anyway, according to the Oxford Dictionary? It's a noun. It's the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and the senses. If that sounds a little bit like learning and remembering and forgetting and all of that, there's a reason, because we do all of those things when we're talking about cognition. In psychology, when studying cognition, we try to figure out how people think, learn, and encounter their world, and then what they do with it. Cognitive psychologists study concept formation, problem solving, decision making, judgment formation, and many more things. Cognitive psychology is a big deal. So concept formation is the way we form concepts or categories of the things in our world based on small sets of examples of that concept. So say, the concept of a cat, you're likely to think of pointy ears, a certain kind of eyes, tail, whiskers, small sets of examples of the concept. And we solve problems when we're trying to figure out things. When we're trying to figure out problems, we go about it in two different ways: algorithms and heuristics. Now, algorithms are a really, really good way to solve problems, but they're not the most efficient. Because when you're talking about algorithms, first thing that comes to my mind is a computer. And what are we, computers? Yes, but no. An algorithm is a slow and methodical way to solve a problem based on logical rules that's guaranteed to work. If you're using an algorithm properly, you will get the answer. It's just going to take forever. Formulas, good example. Computers use algorithms, which is why the faster the processor, the faster they can go through the algorithms they use to get things done. That's why you need a faster processor, because they can't do things outside of their algorithms. They need the algorithms. The reason algorithms work is because they exhaust every possible outcome to arrive at a solution. That's also why they take so darn long. So if you were to try and figure out how many words you could get out of this set of letters, the fact of the matter is, using the algorithmic approach, you'd have over 900,000 options to try before you're able to unscramble these letters. And that's a lot. I know, right? And so because algorithms kind of think, well, let's talk about what else we've got. As humans, we're more than computers. We also use heuristics. So it's the use of thinking strategies to solve problems as opposed to an algorithm. It's far faster than an algorithm. Right. So trial and error is the algorithm approach for all intents and purposes, because you're trying every possible option until you come at the answer. Heuristics is like using a thinking strategy to solve a problem. So while, yes, they are far less time-consuming than algorithms, they're not perfect. You won't always come to the absolute proper answer. So let's look at our set of letters again. Using heuristics, you could be to slap one of the Y's on the end and see what you can come up with. It's a lot faster than the algorithm. It eliminates a lot of the options that you could potentially get wrong. You could then also get rid of any of the YY combos, because in the English language there aren't any. And that, at that point, lowers the amount of options that you have to go through before you come up with a few words that you can get out of that set of letters. Now, there are two kinds of heuristics: representative heuristics and availability heuristics. And while, yes, they're very useful in solving problems, they do have their own issues. Representative heuristics is judging the likelihood of a solution to work based on how well it seems to represent a particular prototype. This kind of problem solving often makes us override statistics or logic, like overestimating the dangers of flying. That's a representative heuristic. Availability heuristics, on the other hand, is anytime we judge the likelihood of a solution based on information most readily available in our memories. So that's why it's called the availability heuristic. So let me ask you this. Do you know which is more common in the English language? For the letter K to appear as the first or third letter in a word. So when you think about it, so some people are saying first, some are saying third. The reality is it's actually third. It's far more common. But words like no, new, kangaroo, they'll come to mind pretty quickly when you're thinking of the letter K. But in reality, words like ask are far more common. Fixation. So there's some challenges to problem solving and thinking. One of those, make, take, bake, lake. Thank you, Sasha. So fixation is being unable to see a problem from a fresh perspective. It's, taking your mental set, sake, nice, or sake, depending on your preference. So fixation is taking your mental set, and it's how you've decided things should be or work. If you get fixated on your mental set, thinking outside of the box, if you will, becomes very difficult. Functional fixedness, on the other hand, is a tendency to only think of familiar functions of an object. Kind of like a schema, yeah. Oh, my pleasure, Ikshita. Thank you so much for attending. You will be able to view this later on. Nice to meet you, Tigist. I will be here next week also. Hopefully we'll fit it better in our time frame. I'll be here for the next one next Tuesday, so hopefully I'll see you guys there. So how can you use 6 matchsticks to make 4 equilateral triangles without breaking any of them? When we're talking about fixation, it's hard to do if you think about it. But what if you do it this way? That's one way to do it. Overconfidence is another challenge to problem solving. It's the tendency to overestimate the accuracy of our beliefs and our judgments. Framing is how the problem or question is presented. So if you ask the question, how you frame it matters. What's the best way to market ground beef? As 25% fat or 75% lean? It's the exact same thing, but saying 25% fat will sell far less than 75% lean. Belief bias is the tendency for pre-existing beliefs to cloud our judgment. So a correct theory would be the major premise is all dogs are animals. Minor premise is all animals have 4 legs. Conclusion, all dogs have 4 legs. That's accurate. Incorrect, God is love, love is blind, Ray Charles is blind, thus Ray Charles is God. Doesn't work, but belief bias can get in our way there. Belief perseverance is our tendency to cling to our beliefs despite contradictory factual evidence. Smokers are really, really guilty of this. They believe that smokers believing that they won't be the ones to get lung cancer is an example of this. There's plenty of other examples. That was just the least offensive. So language is another part of cognition, and be it spoken, written, or gestured, language is the way we communicate meaning to others and ourselves. Phonemes are the smallest distinctive sound unit in a spoken language. Morpheme is the smallest unit that carries meaning. It may be a word or part of a word, like unbelievable, that has 2 morphemes. Excuse me. Animals communicate through movements, gestures, sound, and pheromones. Gestures such as sign language. The rules of language are as follows. Grammar is the system of rules in language that enable us to communicate with and understand others. Semantics are the set of rules by which we derive meaning from morphemes, words, and sentences. Syntax is the rules for the correct order of words in grammatically sensible sentences. This is going to be our last bit before we go to questions. I do appreciate you guys being able to stick around with me, those that were. So this is how language kind of maps itself out. At 4 months, we get babbling speech sounds like ba, da, ma, etc. At 10 months-ish, we get babbling that resembles household language, mama, dada, that sort of thing. At 12 months, we get one-word statement, dog. 24 months, we look using 2-word telegraphic speech, such as mommy up. And it can be even earlier than that, but you're getting the idea. 24 plus months, we start seeing the rapid development of complete sentences, and that's how language goes in short. So that is all. I do appreciate all of you who were able to stick around. I know it's a lot of material. Let's answer some questions real quick, and then I will let all of you go. Do you appreciate your patience? Is episodic memory part of long-term memory? Absolutely, episodic memory is part of long-term memory. It is the first part. So we talked about that a little bit earlier. How do we choose what's short-term memory and what's long-term memory? Well, part of that is paying attention to our senses, and then, yes, I will go over belief bias momentarily, Sasha, thank you. So short-term memory is taking the stuff from our senses and starting to chew through it so that we can actually remember it. And as we go through it, it gets stored in our long-term memory. That was misstored. Always get confused. Do you know a way to remember proactive versus retroactive? We just went over that a little bit earlier. When you're thinking of retroactive, think of old. New information stops you from learning. New information stops you from learning old information. When it comes to Alzheimer's disease, they forget past memories, but they also can't make new ones. What would this be called? So Alzheimer's is kind of a different situation. It's not trauma; it's deterioration. So it's not an aphasia or anything like that. It's not, amnesia. That's a degenerative disorder. Now, the thing about Alzheimer's is they definitely can't struggle to make new memories, especially as the disease progresses. But you will notice that the older memories that are far better stored will stay with them far longer. And sadly, it can get to the point where they'll start thinking that people that they're talking to are long dead relatives or loved ones, because that's further in and better stuck in their memories. So what's the difference between representative and availability heuristics? We just talked about that, but we can go through it one more time. Fixation, heuristics, haha. So representative is judging the likelihood of a solution to work based on how well it seems to represent a particular prototype. Availability is judging the likelihood of a solution based on the information that's most readily available. So that's our K example there. Belief bias. Let me get it. Bum, bum, bum. So belief bias is the tendency that our pre-existing beliefs cloud our judgment. So it's like believing that cars are safer makes us believe that traveling on the road is safer versus taking a plane, right? So at that point, our pre-existing beliefs are clouding our judgment in the face of facts or new information. Does that help, Sasha? I hope it helps. Oh, good. All right, so that's pretty much all I got. Does anybody have? Oh, my pleasure. Is there any other questions before I let you guys go? All right, everybody. I do appreciate you playing along. I will be here next Tuesday for the next section, which will cover development and motivation and motion. What do I think from this section could be an FRQ for the exam? Probably some stuff on how memory is stored and examples of that. Or, yeah, my pleasure, Talia. Thank you. My pleasure, Emily. Thank you. Also, some stuff about belief bias or certain, challenges to learning, like fixation. Let me see what else. You might have some an FRQ on like some of the conditioning stuff, like operant or classical conditioning. I know it's kind of a stretch, but it's possible, especially if they want you to really like talk it out. So that's pretty much where I've got as far as that.